Just to quickly introduce the folks who I have with me here. To my left is Charley Cooper. Charley is the leader of external affairs and legal work at R3, a consortium of companies that are working on enterprise blockchain. To Charley's left is Michael Casey, a journalist, author, commentator, a senior advisor for the Digital Currency Initiative at MIT, also a regular columnist for a great publication called CoinDesk, and a co-author of 2 books on crypto and blockchain with Paul Vigna of the Wall Street Journal. And to his left is Mary Wieck, an engineer who, if it's at IBM and it's blockchain, she's leading it and in charge of it, and helping them to reach people all over the world with this interesting new technology. So I asked the folks ahead of time if, since we're here at the Japan Society, and folks always want to know about applications, if they could each give an example of something specific that's going on with digital ledgers, with blockchain technology in Japan. So Mary, let's start with you.
Sure. So we are doing a number of different applications across countries, but in Japan specifically, we see a lot of activity both in financial services as well as in supply chain and manufacturing. The supply chain side, more on provenance, the financial services, more on how are we changing clearing and settlement. And just one example, MUFG, who I know has been an active participant here, has been working with us on their MUFG coin, which they are running in parallel as a way of facilitating, targeted enterprise access for clearing and settlement. And it's just one of an example of others that are happening around financial payments, around stock exchange trades, and also around loyalty points programs representing assets in a trade.
All right, since I wear more than one hat, I'm actually going to give 2 examples. The first one being, yes, I play a role at the same company that Brady's at, CoinDesk. In addition to being a columnist, I'm a chairman of the advisory board, a part-time position. And in that capacity, I'm going to make the announcement today, since Brady's a good neutral journalist who is here not to rep the business, but to actually talk about topics. I'm going to represent CoinDesk and say that CoinDesk has just launched CoinDesk Japan. So the license is with Z Corp, which is a unit of, as many of you might know, SoftBank, and they will be putting out content under the CoinDesk brand. So that's a brand new announcement today. So that's a thing that's happening in Japan with relation to crypto, certainly in terms of the coverage side of it. My other hat that I wear is with MIT Media Lab, where I'm a set of advisor at the Digital Currency Initiative, and we've actually got a couple of members supporting the DCI from Japan. Some of you might know Joey Ito, who's the director of the Media Lab, is obviously Japanese, a lot of connections in Japan. And so the Digital Garage, which is a company he was involved in, is a supporter of the DCI. And Nomura Research Institute, Nomura, is also engaged with the DCI, the Digital Currency Initiative. And there's a researcher there that's doing some interesting stuff around social capital. I'm not sure I can go into too much detail, but it's this concept of how the number of contacts that you have becomes a metric by which you can measure things like your creditworthiness and so forth. And they're looking into ways to incorporate this data, which is actually derived from cell phone proximity, into measures of self-sovereign identity, which we might get into a bit later on.
Great. So Japan itself is actually a massively important market for R3 for a whole host of reasons. Probably the biggest one is that all 5 of the top 5 Japanese banks are investors in our company, and SBI is our biggest investor. And we recently launched a joint venture with SBI in Japan. I think the announcement went out about a month ago, 6 weeks ago. I honestly lose track of how much media we push out. For those of you who don't know Katao-san, who is the CEO of SBI, he is an absolute force of nature, in all the best possible ways. And his drive to innovate and take the Japanese financial services sector to a level beyond which it can even think of right now, and the drive that he puts behind our company and other companies in the blockchain and crypto space in which he's invested has been absolutely critical, I think, in the development of the industry globally. So while he is a local presence to Japan, he has a global, he really has had an impact that's felt globally. So we spend a lot of time actually in Japan, both on the business side as well as meeting with regulators.
Cool. And I can throw out one quick example of from my own coverage. I mostly write about kind of like smaller, scrappier startups in the space, but one really big company that I occasionally touch on is Line, the big Japanese messaging app, which is, you know, publicly traded company. And Line has been making a ton of investments in the crypto space, launched its own cryptocurrency, has a bunch of experiments with sort of like little side applications it's putting out there. So that's another one too, which of a company that may be familiar to some folks here. So this whole topic of blockchain and crypto, as you know, hopefully most people know, started with the idea of Bitcoin that came out 10 years ago. And you know, fun fact, the original Bitcoin white paper never actually uses the term blockchain. That's a term that came along later. But since then, it's, you know, the idea has evolved and developed, and people have sort of have forked the technology a ton of different ways. And that's kind of, we're here to talk about some of the things that have happened more on among those big forks, and sort of the idea of using the blockchain more than crypto. But there's a big debate that continues to go on in this space is this question of, are blockchains better off as they were initially envisioned, as these trustless platforms that are open for anyone to engage in and are public, or are we better off using the fundamental technology but keeping them private, controlling you know, who has access to them, who gets to, you know, make decisions about them? So I asked our panel if they could, everyone up here has sort of got a dog in that fight on at least some level. So if you guys could sort of make your case for private or public as you see it.
Roll up the sleeves.
Yeah, roll up the sleeves, yeah.
It's going to get nasty.
That's right. Who starts?
Sure.
All right.
Take a lead.
I'll start, and I generally don't like the public versus private. I think that's an anomaly in and of itself. I think the real question is anonymous versus permissioned, not public versus private, because you can have a permissioned network that is in fact public and allows all participants. You just have to declare your identity. Sovereign is a good example. Stellar is another good example. Both public networks that do have an identity component, because we feel that most enterprises we deal with, and particularly those in any regulated industry or that engage with governments, are not going to want to not know who they're dealing with. So if you go on the premise of trusted exchange for any of these aspects, then to me the best of both worlds is a permissioned network, and you can have those be dedicated to a specific function or industry or use case, smart contract, or they could be totally public and still have a permissioned identity component.
All right, so
You're stuck in between us.
I am.
You gotta,
So
you gotta
I'm
take
gonna
the
just,
tough.
and then I'll get hit from this side as well. Look, I think I for one, I think there's a huge place for private and permissioned anonymous, whatever we're going to call these things, networks that have a permissioning component to them. I'm not suggesting that they are not useless, that they are not useful. What I would argue, though, is that the question of how you onboard human beings into this process and whether or not, and who is allowed to participate and so forth, is often one of identity. The question of being able to prove one's uniqueness is critical. So it may be that we achieve this global permissionless network, which might not be the right word, but global open network, let's call it that.
I'm good with that.
That looks a lot like the internet, right? Because we don't want to have to sort of, the internet is, for all of its flaws, essentially something you can just engage with directly. If you're working with Facebook or Google or whoever, then all of a sudden you have an identity. But the internet itself, it is and should be open and accessible. So much of the world has very, very flawed identification procedures, right? There are 2.5 billion people around the world who don't have identities. But even for those of us who do have identity, there's a real challenge when it comes to things like, are we going to create seamless digital exchange systems that if all of a sudden there's identity connected to it, it ceases to act like cash because it doesn't become as fungible. So there's really important questions around what do we mean by identity, we may get onto the question of self-sovereign identity and whether or not we can manufacture versions of this that don't expose who I am and can act as proxies for those of us who don't have a state ID and so forth. That may well be a solution, but my basic premise is that we really want to get away from silos. We don't want walled gardens. We want things that are open. And I'll use the example, in fact, that came out of Japan. It's kind of handy to do this. But Joey Ito, my boss at the Media Lab, he was instrumental in convincing NTT in the early days of the internet not to build a kind of a Minitel or a Prodigy type closed network for the internet and to open up a standard that was based upon TCP/IP. And it was actually one of those sort of big moments actually for the whole global internet, because this big country of Japan said, this is what we should do.
Yeah.
So we had for a while there Prodigy and AOL and everybody else all thinking that they could keep all their value inside by managing these closed networks. But the world wanted open systems. We wanted to be able to send emails to everybody. We wanted to be able to connect. And that was what won. And it wins partly because once you're open, you have the biggest number of brains and ideas and connectivity. So the bottom line is how we get there is maybe open to debate, but we need to keep our eyes on that goal of the openness structure. And I'm not all that keen on institutions that are trying to, wrap it all up into a closed network.
Yeah. So I would pick up on something that Michael was talking about in terms of the siloing, because ultimately the beauty of the internet is, for those of you who are not aware, the internet is not one thing. It is a network of networks that know how to talk to each other. Now, if we all built our own blockchain solutions that didn't know how to talk to each other and could do certain transactions on the one that my company built and certain that IBM built and certain that various different other companies built, we would quickly find ourselves in a different but similar situation that we currently have today, where everyone's on different technology platforms, assets are trapped, there's great inefficiencies, you're trying to communicate between various different institutions about an event that did or did not happen and how much was it worth. And I'm talking mainly financial services, but that could be, are you seeing the same thing in healthcare or automotive insurance policies that were written, or mortgages? Did you actually buy the property or not? And if we're sitting in different worlds and we're unable to communicate across these various different platforms, we really haven't solved for much. As a business standpoint, though, we run a commercial enterprise in my company. We can't build everything for everybody. So what we're focused on doing is building the network that makes most sense for our clients, because it's our clients and investors that are asking us to do it for them. And we're working at the same time in various different capacities on what we call interoperability. That's this sort of loaded term that no one quite knows what it means. They all sort of have ideas as to what interoperability would mean and how complicated it's going to be to get there. I don't think this is an overnight problem to be solved, but I think in the meantime, those of us that are building networks appeal to various different constituencies that have something they want to do with it. And at least in the case of my company, the permissioned construct works the best, because they are highly complex, heavily regulated industries that have a mandate from their governments, from their regulators, to do business with known parties that have been checked through KYC and various different other protocols to ensure that they're allowed to do business with that party. But that doesn't mean that long term we don't see a potential set of solutions that might exist on a completely unpermissioned network. I have to be honest, one of the things that Brady talked about was the Satoshi white paper never mentioned blockchain. And now if you ask people what blockchain are, we might get 3 different answers from this stage, right? But we're all sort of in the same industry. And what I would extrapolate out 3 years from now, do we have the same idea of what a blockchain is or distributed ledger technology is? Do we have the same idea of what protocols are necessary? I think we're all, or do we know what interoperability means? I think we're all working towards that, but I would caution those who are expecting the sort of light switch approach and all of a sudden the world goes blockchain. This is going to take longer than the newest software update on your iPhone. This isn't going to come in overnight because you leave it plugged in and next thing you know you wake up and your interface has changed. It just doesn't work like that. Wholesale technology changes. Takes a long time. So I guess I didn't necessarily answer the question other than to say, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, an open or a closed or a private or public version may work in different settings.
I just pick up on that a little bit though, because I think that, your point that you made, our clients are asking for this, we deliver. I think that's you have really no choice. That is the way business is. And so no one this isn't sort of a value judgment. It's just how do you, while on the one hand focusing on that, make sure you're not architecting for a future in which all of a sudden that model has actually made you redundant? And I think this is the biggest challenge. And the example I like to give is in the supply chain space, because it's inevitable that supply chains right now are going to want private permission systems. So this is like, it's built around massive compliance burdens. You take a long time to onboard other people into the supply chain, so you check on the quality of their work, and then they become a member of this club. Now it's a club of however many people. That club becomes its own closed network, right? We're all going to make sure that we're all managing the ledger collectively and monitoring the flow of goods. What happens when all of a sudden there's a startup who can do something far more efficiently than any member of that club? Now one of those club members has actually got effectively veto power. So what you're doing is you're baking into the system the capacity to prevent the entire community from embracing new technologies. So whether or not it's a way of saying, we adopt a permissionless access, I don't know what it is, but the point of the matter is you need to ensure that you're ready for that. And I would argue that supply chains and manufacturing is about to get hit with a very flattening force. When 3D printing becomes uniform and universal, then all of a sudden I don't need to source my ball bearings from Japan. I can have them printed out by a printer just down the road. How I onboard that it's now a question of the reliability of this IoT device. It's an on-demand rather than an on-supply model, right? It's like you've got to move quick. And that requires onboarding very quickly. Closed permission systems typically have long onboarding processes. Whereas if there's an environment where I don't need to trust so much who you are, but I can trust that all the data that you're permissioning into this and so forth is reliable, we have a more fluid environment. So it may be that you get competed out by being too closed, is all I'm saying.
I think there's a middle ground, though, which is, again, I think the 2 points of being open and being permissioned is the combination that gives you the most benefit for enterprise use cases. And in the supply chain space today, there's tons of electronic data interchange and other standards for supply chain optimization, marketplaces, et cetera. When you think about the internet as a standard, it is still, and all of our interactions are point to point. If you are communicating with any community, you are going through a broker, and that broker is controlling that access even today, right? So if you are now able to really embrace peer-to-peer communications in that ecosystem with a level of trust, that your supplier, that the endpoint, then you have the opportunity to be as disruptive, but also engage in that way. I mean, some of the work we're doing with Maersk on TradeLens is exactly that. How do you actually digitize all of the documents that need to be shared and let everybody have access at one time so that you have a trusted bill of lading? That can be equally impactful to share now with open standards with the banking community for trade finance. One of the biggest fraud elements is when you take one of these, bill of lading that I got an order from somebody and now take it to 3 banks. How do they know that it wasn't duplicated?
So there's a couple things in there I feel like we probably should unpack for the crowd, maybe a few things. But I want to go back a little bit because I think this is probably worth unpacking and just make sure I'm right about this. Because the thing I heard both Mary and Charley saying, but I want to make sure I have this right, is a part of the argument for permissioned blockchains is kind of, if I'm not wrong, it's sort of that many of your clients kind of don't even really have a choice precisely, right? I mean, like, there isn't really an option for a lot of the big companies each of you work with to function on networks that have nodes that people don't. And so what I mean by nodes for folks is like you run these distributed databases that lots and lots of people have access to. Nodes are anyone, generally speaking very broadly, with a copy of that database, and they're all sharing around new bits of data they're getting in there. I feel like a lot of your clients don't really have the choice to be on a network that has, am I right about that? Could you guys sort of talk about why that is?
So now I'm the lawyer. I put my legal hat on.
Thank you.
The answer is yes, that's true for now. but it may not necessarily be the truth forever, which is transitioning to the technical side. The key there is building a network that can operate in a permissioned sense now, because the ecosystem that it is supporting requires that. But if and when at such time the law and regulatory communities in various different industries catch up to or become more comfortable with the idea of a far more permissionless type ecosystem, your platform was designed to do that from the beginning. Right now, so let's take financial services just as one example, although I mean, we could talk about a whole bunch of other things on the stage. Financial services is the easy punching bag because it is so heavily regulated. Every time that I'm in Japan, I'm not just visiting clients and investors, I'm visiting the Bank of Japan and the securities, their version of the SEC, the SFC. Our Japan office liaises with governments all the time. The legal departments and the government relations departments in all of the Japanese banks are constantly in front of their regulators explaining why they're doing what they're doing and why it's okay to be doing that. Could we get to a point down the road where that becomes unnecessary, or where governments become more accepting of this idea of these open systems and these permissionless systems? It's entirely possible. But it's not happening quickly. I'm a former regulator. I can tell you nothing's happening quickly. Let me give you an example. Dodd-Frank, the accord that came out of Japan in 2009 in the wake of the global financial crisis was 10 years ago that it came out, 10 years or maybe a couple months less. MiFID II, which is the European regulatory version attempting to comply with those overall principles, went into effect 6 months ago. Or 9 months ago. It took the European community 10 years to get their regulations up to speed with at least this agreement in principle that had happened right in the wake of the global financial crisis. If you extrapolate that out as one example, and you go to regulators and like, all right, here's the deal. We have this great idea. It's a distributed computer system, and your banks are not going to know who they're trading with, but it's okay for the following set of reasons. I can tell you, because I'm in these rooms all over the world, the response you get is, no, not now, not yet. But, and this is the really cool thing, is in some ways, I feel like, but not in some ways, in many ways, I feel like we're at the beginning of the journey. Right? I mean, it may not feel like that. There are days we can't wait for a vacation because we've been living this thing for so long. But for the majority of the world, no one knows actually what blockchain is yet. In most industries, they sort of hear about it and they throw some research money at it, but they're not sure how it's going to impact them. This is years and years in the making, but that doesn't mean it isn't possible. So back to the thing I said up front, the ability to design a platform in the beginning that has the ability later on to adapt to new regulatory and legal structures and a more open stroke permissionless system once the rule of law catches up with the whims of technology, that's the key to success in the long term, and in part addressing the idea that you create yourself to set up to fail because someone else is going to come in and steal your lunch.
Just pick on a couple of points on that. I often use this line, and I actually used it in a column that ran 2 days ago.
I read it.
And that is that,
It's really
like,
good,
if you want to talk about what, you know, I use this amongst most audiences sometimes, say, look, a fully functioning, decentralized, permissionless blockchain, in that environment, it should not matter that ISIS, right, the terrorist organization ISIS, is running one or a number of nodes. And you look at people and they go, what? How could that possibly be something that's acceptable? And the answer is because it doesn't, the system design of the structure is that it literally doesn't matter who you are. That's not the question. It's whether or not you are appropriately able, both incentivized and able to take over that network. It's certainly the design of Bitcoin. It is such that, you know, and we've proven it after 10 years, that they've never been able to take it down. Others have. Other permissionless blockchains have been, it's possible to accumulate enough computing power that you get more than 51% of the network, and then you can start to change the ledger, and that's a big problem. But at the end of the line, if these things are designed in such a way that they are sufficiently decentralized and sufficiently diverse and sufficiently actually expensive to take over, then they become secure. And so the question becomes completely different, right? But to your point, Charlie, how are you going to get regulators? Their whole business is around, where does the buck stop? Who's in charge? Who do I sue? Who do I subpoena? That is the core question for a regulator.
Yeah.
And so it is a really difficult shift. But the bottom line is we need to think about these things differently. And look, the internet has some of these qualities, right? You know, we have bodies that act as quasi-regulators, ICANN and IETF and these others. But at the end of the day, there is this essentially lawless nature to the structure of the internet. So we have managed to live with these things. And I've also was somewhat impressed by the way the SEC, not necessarily officially as a body, but has kind of given hints that when they questioned the idea of of Ethereum's ICO, came along and said, look, it's no longer, because it's evolved into one, it is a sufficiently decentralized network that we don't think that Ether, the currency that runs on Ethereum, should be regarded now as a security. They were actually applauding in that sense from the perspective of whether or not they should sue or go after the founders of Ethereum. They were applauding the fact that it was decentralized, which is essentially a question of how permissionless it is. So there is an acceptance, there is an understanding around certain regulators that this structure is valid and that it can stand up, and there are reasons to actually accept it as a good thing.
I would jump in on one thing on the Ethereum thing. It sounds like a little technicality, but it is important. The signals coming out of the SEC have been somewhat mixed, but as a policy matter, they are discussing the fact that Ether seems to have evolved to a security.
Yeah.
Their enforcement division, however, has not yet said anything public or disavowed the willingness or the ability to use enforcement authority to police those markets if they think they start acting like securities.
Fair enough, but
Right.
yeah.
And just to build on what you're saying, I mean, I'm right in saying, Charlie, it's like, in terms of the SEC saying anything, it's just sort of like some officials have made some comments, but they're
Yeah,
having
there's no rulemaking.
It's like
Hyman's speech. As well.
Yeah.
But it was seen as a kind of
it's a
testimony.
good sign,
and it was
It's
a
a start.
sign of movement. That's
Yeah.
the point, right? Yeah.
But I think the most important point of that is it was viewed against the cryptocurrency Ether and whether that was a security or
Right.
effectively, because of the volume, a currency now, as opposed to what does a coin or a token or some other ICO or security asset actually mean in a regulated context. So I think there's a real distinction based on some of the views on if you got enough volume on any given crypto, then is it really a currency? And I don't think it's really related to is it anonymous or not. It is, have you got enough volume that there's liquidity in this to avoid disruption? I mean, most of it is concerned about fraud.
Yeah.
But I think
And manipulation.
I think
Correct.
A little bit more than just volume, though. It's like the argument that Ethereum Foundation will make as to why Ether is not a security is because it is a commodity, because it is a integral piece of the network, and it will not function. A quick 101 for those of you guys.
Right.
You
But then they have
can
another
think
problem,
about
it's a
Bitcoin and
commodity.
Ether. It's not just a currency. It's not just something by which you trade. It is actually integrally important to the whole incentive and power structure
Consensus
of
model.
a permissionless network. Without that, you can't, which is one of the reasons why private, non-permissioned networks do not necessarily have currencies in the middle of them. But you can't have a permissionless system like Bitcoin or Ethereum without a currency because it's part of the entire design. So having said that, I think what's interesting about what Hyman was saying was not just that there's lots of volume, but also, we see this thing is not just something that people raise money when they issued it, but it also is an integral part of how this network functions.
Right.
And therefore, we can see it as this utility function rather than something else. Anyway, it gets very technical, but I think that's the reason I was raising that is because I saw it as a sign that there was an acknowledgement of the value of a decentralized network and the role that these things can play in that.
Right.
I'd add one thing, though. Sorry, I know we keep doing
that's
this, but
good,
this
'cause
but this is
attorneys-
actually
good
important.
attention's always
It's important. The SEC has said it's not a security, or it may not be a security, and they may not have jurisdiction over it. If it's a commodity, then the CFTC does.
Sure.
Correct.
That doesn't mean the CFPB, which is the Consumer Protection Agency, can't step in and say, well, mom and pops that have been investing in Ether who lost their shirt during the crypto winter, they shouldn't be protected. Like, who do we come after in those instances? So the fact that one regulator in one country has decided they're not concerned about it isn't necessarily indicative of the fact that that country or like-situated agencies in other countries are not going to step in and take a different stance. And this is where it becomes really complicated, and there's nothing, honestly, we can do about this. We just have to keep building technology and hope the law catches up. By definition, regulators are limited by the borders of their nation state or the transnational entity in which they operate. By definition, the decentralized networks that we're building for our clients are global.
Right.
How do you layer on regional jurisdictions on top of a global network in a way that allows innovation to flourish, but allows some measure of coordination with the rest of the globe? Even, again, back to the MiFID II thing, 10 years on, they finally put MiFID II in place now in Europe, and it's at odds with various different regulations that were put in place in the US under Dodd-Frank, and various different regulations that were put in place in Japan and Korea and the rest in the wake of the global financial crisis. The idea of regulatory coordination is mind-blowingly complex, and that's why where we hope this gets to is sort of where the internet got to, where is at some point it's out of the barn, the thing is going, and the regulators are just trying to catch up, but it's too late it's too late for them to do something which would be misguided in our view, and therefore stamp down an innovation. And part of the discussions that we have so much with people in the legal community is, we know you're unsure, we know you're nervous, we do know what we're doing, you have to let this innovation flourish for all these very, very good reasons and all the potential impacts blockchain can have, but only if you give us a little room to develop this stuff. And right now, the global regulatory community, by and large, has sat by, and I think the SEC's approach to that is one example of them taking a step back. They're not comfortable. I was down there last week, I'm down there again tomorrow, but they're sitting on their hands for now.
But I think that's a case where there are two aspects. One is continued education with all the different regulators around the world. You know, the other tack that we have found very, very effective is, you know, whether it's an auditor or a regulator, give them a node on the network so they can actually see the traffic and get understanding. And the third is to actually drive enough economic benefit that most of those regulators are actually looking for means by which they can improve the GDP or the productivity of any of their respective countries. And by the fact that these are global networks, if you can actually show that, you know, a trade that took 250 documents to ship a container of flowers from Mombasa to Rotterdam can now be done digitally in a quarter of the time, you know, now you're getting a trade incentive that takes away some of the fear and uncertainty. You know, most of them are trying to protect their citizens and protect their data. If they actually see a benefit for them, you know, then you're in a much better place.
Well, okay, so I have to go back to the first question. I want to go into logistics soon because I think that's valuable. But this point brings me back to the first question. So when you look at Web 2 right now, the mobile web, the biggest apps on there, like the most powerful apps on there, are very heavily messaging apps. You know, Line, WhatsApp, WeChat. They're all doing basically the same thing, and they just became popular in one area of the world and built a lot of network effects, but they don't talk to each other. If you look at Web 1.0, and I'm right about this, because I used to be a tech reporter, still pretty sure the biggest application on the entire internet, hands down, nothing else is even close, is still email, right? And the difference there is email is a wide open protocol that, you know, anyone can, you know, spin up a node, anyone can participate, anyone can set up a server. Whereas when we got into the mobile world, everyone wanted to have their own thing. So when we talk about this whole, we got to have innovation move forward, I mean, isn't that an argument for the unpermissioned approach is actually better if we look back at those examples? I mean, in terms of economic benefit, sort of global, you know, growth?
Our whole view would be a standard would actually be a benefit. Right now, there are multiple competing technologies, and therefore our whole focus is on, you know, an open by design approach. Nothing this big can be done without an open community. And to me, that's not just open source, that's open governance, that's really driving community innovation. We actually started on Ethereum and ultimately wound up, for all the reasons that our enterprise customers were looking for, getting together with a bunch of other like-minded folks with the Linux Foundation to create the Hyperledger community, which now has over 300 members and is focused on an open governed, open ecosystem. To the extent that that becomes a de facto standard, then you actually get adoption just based on that. But there are many other players who are using open technology elements or have a .org that are driving it. I think part of the question is who governs that? How are innovations into those communities decided? Are they decided by one company or a large governing body? How do you extend that and drive it? And there are new standards efforts too. Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is a good example. The Hyperledger community is working with them to see, can you get to a standard? Right now there are multiple forks. One analyst I talked to thought there were over 70 forks of Ethereum right now. When you look at the private space, which one are you going to pick? That definitely narrows your choices in terms of interoperability globally. So, our focus is where is there the most community activity around innovation, around enterprise class blockchains, and how do you not limit that just, we're very heavily focused on Hyperledger Fabric because we think it has some of the properties that folks are looking for right now, but we do work with Stellar, we do work with Sovereign, we do work with other Ethereum derivatives, because I don't think one network will rule them all, so to speak. But right now, where are those opportunities to actually drive value and show results is the focus.
Just really quick, just so for folks know, Sovereign is a consortium effort to get identity onto the blockchain, so like who you are and where you are in the world. And Stellar is one of these cryptocurrency projects that's been around for a while, kind of more at the startup level, but is working with IBM. Anyway, sorry, Michael.
I would just make this point that I think is, I don't think much we can do about it, but the early days of the internet, and when these early protocols were being developed, right, TCP/IP, SMTP, these were the foundational layers upon which this very open structure was built. It was built by a bunch of nerds in Stanford and MIT.
And there was
DARPA,
no money.
And there was no money in it.
No
It was
money,
all academic money, right?
Yep.
So they were driven by a mission to just make this cool thing.
Yeah.
We now live in a completely different environment. This is a competitive, and part of that's good, right? Because money is a motivator, and there's this whole fat protocol idea that I don't know if I buy into it, but it's certainly discussable that for the first time, actually by making a protocol open, you can be rewarded for that through the currency that's part of that. The problem is that there's multiple open protocols. Like the open sourceness of it is actually fragmented. They're all open source, but they're all competing with each other.
Yeah.
So how do we corral everybody together? Do you need government? Do you need some academic institution? I mean, one of the reasons why MIT stepped into the fray and said, look, we'll form the Digital Currency Initiative, because we thought Bitcoin needed to have this steward, it needed to have a place where there could be unbiased, academic-driven research, and it's still the driving ethos of the place. But the problem is that was really about Bitcoin at the time, and now there's so many other different things to be looking at. So I don't know. I mean, I'm actually really interested in the interoperability question, whether or not the real winner in this is not Hyperledger versus Ethereum versus Stellar versus anything else, but it's somebody who figures out what the atomic swap, and this is going to be something that's, I'm not going to go into explaining what an atomic swap is, but that who figures out what protocol it is that actually gets these assets to talk to each other, so that the open internet is actually a knitting effect of all these different fragmented silos together, and that's the holy grail.
Well, I have a follow-up question on this openness thing that I want to ask both you guys, but I'm going to tell a quick story which I think might help illuminate some things about just the power of money in this space right now. And in the early days of the internet, there was no money. Also in the early days of blockchain, there was no money too. So when Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he was, spun up his first Bitcoin node, some other people were able to also make Bitcoin nodes. That just means, computers that were sharing this data, doing some work, got rewarded by getting some free Bitcoins. Just a bunch of nerdy engineers playing around with this. It was no big deal. It took years to develop before it was worth anything, right? So very recently, another group of nerdy engineers who saw some problems with Bitcoin, specifically in privacy. They thought that it was a problem that Bitcoin isn't particularly private. They wanted to build it better. They wanted to do it all just like Bitcoin, and it was this project called Grin. So it was going to be completely fair. There was going to be no way in which rich people could come in early and buy up a bunch of tokens and things like that, and they were just going to try to spin it up just like Bitcoin did. Okay, well, here's the problem. Now we're in this world in which all this stuff is worth a lot of money. So as opposed to when Bitcoin started and nobody cared, and it was just some people playing around with their computers and people joined as they wanted to, and it was able to develop organically. When Grin came along, a ton of rich people were like, we bet this is going to be worth our time. And so they just dumped a ton of computers at it. And so what was meant to be this like fair and open start, because this stuff is worth something now, was profoundly not fair, because the world has just changed. So, so that's a thing that happens when things start to be worth a ton of money. So on the point of money, a question I want to ask both of you.
I think there's a difference, though, of money versus crypto. If there wasn't a digital asset associated with that network and you couldn't buy in to get a 51% stake, it changes the whole question, right?
So here's a different question. So to your point, and for both of you guys, I'm a startup. I buy your argument. I've got some great idea about what'll make financial services work better, or how logistics could be faster with the blockchain. I want to start a company that's built on your two protocols. How much does it cost me to get started with either of your platforms? Like how expensive is it to get going on Hyperledger or on R3? Like, sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of us, it's free because we're open source, and that's the same with Hyperledger.
But is that practically true? Is that like really true? Can I really get going, or like is it?
Yeah.
I mean, well, there are startup costs with anything. I mean, you need to buy your computer, and you maybe need to hire your buddy to come sit in the garage with you and write computer code or whatever else it is, or use our toolkit to develop an app. But it's open source. I mean, they're both open source, so you can go home today and download the code, and you're off to the races.
So are you guys, can you talk about some of the startups that are coming in? Some of the newer, smaller, scrappier companies?
Yeah, I mean, there's a litany of them, sure. Happy to.
Couple favorites.
Can I just make one interjection, because I know it's but like, the one
Before we
thing
get
is,
into our
the one thing
shameless
is-
sales pitch?
No, exactly. I mean, just to sort of put this, one of the cost factors that's always going to be there is the bottleneck of talent. Because yes, you can download the software and deal with it. Somebody has to develop it for you to start with it, and that's where we're seeing the money cost, right? You got to find enough developers who understand this stuff, who can do it, and that's a cost factor. That's not anybody's fault other than maybe the educators. We haven't educated enough of them. I don't know, but yeah, that's all I'm saying.
No, that's very true.
Yeah.
Like the technology, the pipeline of getting developers in the community, that's a real issue. Sorry, go ahead.
So let's take Hyperledger Fabric for a second. It is it is open source, freely available. Anybody can take it and download it. It's also available on the most clouds. There are offerings by Oracle, by SAP, by Amazon, by Microsoft, by IBM, all providing a platform-based support directly on their cloud for blockchain. So you can download it and you can run it on your own server. From our perspective, we take that code and incorporate it into a platform that you can start for free. But if you want an enterprise-grade support you want the support model, you want the ability to manage and monitor all the nodes and all the network traffic and all of those other things, you can buy that. So from an open innovation perspective, if you want help actually building the smart contracts, we obviously can do that too. So we have about 500 different client engagements around the world right now. About 100 of them are active networks that are transacting business. And we also work with the startup and the philanthropic community. We have an accelerator with Columbia University that's operating right now. The first round of startups that are working with the platform are actually doing their kind of Shark Tank equivalent on Wednesday, and we'll be reading out. And all kinds of very different industry participants that range from folks that are helping build on top of our food initiative, Food Trust, to provide a token back to farmers that are maintaining sustainability practices and rewarding them with extra capability. So you want to trace farm to table, you can do that, but now how do you further incent the farmers to go organic, to go sustainably raising, to do free range chickens, what have you. And the retailers are supporting the same. Carrefour, who's one of the, second largest retailer in the world, is got an initiative for a mobile app where you can trace where your chicken came from, and they have private labeled a set of suppliers that actually are practicing sustainable farming, and that's a differentiator for their private label meat and poultry. So
I want to come back to this same point and have Charley do it too. But as long as you gave those examples, could you just walk us through really quickly from a logistics perspective in terms of getting a thing from a producer out to an ultimate buyer? What is the distributed ledger doing? Why is Hyperledger particularly good in this application? I don't mind if you promote your product. I think that's useful for folks. But what is it doing that the legacy software did poorly?
And typically in the supply chain space, blockchain, multiple kinds of blockchain solve two problems that you couldn't solve before. One was provenance. You really didn't have a good trusted way of tracing provenance all the way back to the origin.
So that's a fancy word of where something came from and where it's been.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the second is, many call it the one up, one down rule. In most of our current supply chains, they naturally think that everything is linear. Okay, you went from the farmer to the picker to the packer to the distribution center and it is just a linear flow end to end from the farm to you on your table. And in reality, if you want to either trace back or optimize for the freshness of that food or process a food recall, romaine lettuce last year was a big issue in terms of E. coli outbreaks. There were 488 U.S. product recalls for food last year. How do you actually find all the places that went? And because all of the existing systems are one up, one down, that I only have visibility to the one immediately before me or the one immediately after me, and now you're putting this on a distributed ledger, you can see all of them at the same time, you can shrink the amount of time required for that dramatically. In a test we did of mangoes from Mexico and pork from China for Walmart, the best, and they are truly an expert in global supply chain, their best traceback test for, unpackaged product like this was over 6 days, and we were able to do it just over 2 seconds. So because you had all the data at one time, you actually could tell all the sources where that produce came from.
And is that because everyone working with Walmart had its own database and just wasn't?
Well, there are multiple separate silos of information. Some are in an ERP system, some are using, small farmers, if they have a spreadsheet, that's...
It's on paper.
That's a lot, right? So you're really trying, and there's a lot of other innovation that's happening, mobile and, digital labeling and QR codes, and we're using crypto anchors for high-value things where you can actually put a tiny computer, literally, a dot that can actually provide that direct sensing as IoT.
I just want to point in here that might be useful for folks who are sort of grappling with what all this means, and why do we care about the fact that there's SAP systems versus Oracle systems, and there's no communication across the system? It's because of what I would call the cost of trust. Because once you've got a siloed set of records, you have to reconcile this piece of records against that piece of records, and every hop along the way, you've got accountants that are having to go through invoices and see whether this you're telling me it's this.
Dispute
It's not
resolution.
because we don't trust each other. It's not IBM's not a trustworthy company per se, but because I'm a separate entity and all of my interests are separate from IBM's, you're selling to me, I'm buying from you, I have to reconcile that. That is an incredibly time-consuming exercise. I like to think about the skyscrapers of the world and just think of how many cubicles are filled with accountants simply doing reconciliation, right? If you have a global view of what's happening across all the companies you're dealing with, and everybody can see it at once, and you've got various methods for protecting privacy, which are critical, you can essentially really get beyond all of that, and things can move much, much more quickly. The cost of trust is a huge burden to commerce, and I don't think people fully understand how powerfully how powerful an impediment it is.
Well, I can give an example for that. I don't know how many of y'all buy luxury goods, but a big problem in the luxury goods market is you can't actually know if this $3,000 handbag that you just bought did actually come from the factory that that it is meant to have come from, right? There's just a lot of knockoffs out there in the world, and this is one of the applications people are talking about for crypto. Is you could put a private key, like Mary was talking about, the little dot on it or whatever, so that every time somebody transferred it, that was logged in a public blockchain, so you know that there is only one of those bags and it only exists in one place in the world. So that's a thing you could do. So that's a real tangible example of the trust thing. So okay, so we've talked about logistics, moving stuff around. What is hard about moving money around, and how does distributed ledgers make that work better?
Sure. So actually, I'll play off something that Michael talked about, was this idea of reconciliations. If you all see the movie Wall Street or Margin Call or Liar's Poker or any of these movies, you think banking is all traders in front of computers making buy and sell decisions and throwing phones at interns and making a shit ton of money.
Margin Call's really good.
Right.
See that one. Really? Yeah, I love it.
Kind of put me to sleep. But anyway.
I loved it.
So you think bankers are traders. You turn on CNBC and it's guys shouting at each other in a pit like, wow, that's banking. That's really what's happening. That's not banking. Banking is pre-trade and post-trade. It's middle and back office drudgery. It's reconciliations and fund accounting and all sorts of garbage. If you think about garbage, they're lovely people. But if you think about, reporters in the room. But if you think, here's a military analogy, and this applies to traders as well. For every one war fighter in a combat zone, there's on average 40 to 100 people behind that person, making sure that they have the food, they have the armaments, their equipment is working. I mean, you go through a whole litany of things. That trader out on a desk that's looking at a screen that's deciding whether or not to buy pork belly futures is backed up by thousands of people, not each one, but the industry of banking is mainly people not doing the sexy stuff that you read about in the newspaper. It's all of the stuff that's required to make that trade happen. Because just because two traders agree on a phone call or over a matching engine that a trade happened doesn't mean that the trade happened. You may think today you sold 100 shares of IBM. You may not have sold it. It may sell 2 days from now. Now, you may think because you went through your portal, like, oh, I sold it, I'm not worried about it anymore. That doesn't mean that the trade is not still processing behind the scenes. There are billions of dollars a day in derivatives transactions around the world that are settled by people on telephones using fax machines, still in 2019. That's not a joke. That's crazy, right? So I'm borrowing this reconciliation idea, but this is massively important because you asked the question about money, transferring money around. Just like products get lost, or just like handbags get lost, or you're not sure where they came from, money vanishes. Or money doubles up and you're looking at an account, you're like, I don't have that much money, where the hell did that come from, right? It's amazing how often this happens every day. So what DLT allows effectively, and I'm dramatically oversimplifying this, is to ensure that when a trade happens, all that middle and back office stuff actually happens at the time of the trade, and it ultimately eliminates the need. We're still working on getting there, but will eliminate the need for this massive apparatus of reconciliation that costs so much money. Money is no different than in terms of its ability to get lost or missent or arrive at the wrong. I mean, you ever gone down to your front door and you got a package? You're like, my name is not Brady. Where did this come from? I don't know who this guy is. Well, what do you got to do? You got to call Amazon. You got to send it back or whatever. The idea when working properly with a distributed ledger is nobody pays me unless I deserve to get paid. That I've been identified as the recipient. You've been identified as the sender. We've agreed on the transaction up front, and it happens in real time in a way that doesn't require fixes later on. So now, granted, what I'm talking about is live in very small areas today. We have certain apps. IBM has certain apps. There are very different companies that do things. We do collateral management on a platform called HQLAX, gold trading on something called Tradewind. But big, massive infrastructure players like Swift and DTCC and Market and these folks are working on DLT solutions today because it goes to the core of their business model and how they operate. So talk about real world impacts. This isn't the kind of stuff that most people see, But all these added costs ultimately get funneled back into the financial system and passed on to you all. Because the banks aren't going to pay them, right? They're going to make sure that their consumers do. These costs are passed on. Well, you take that out, that's capital that could be reallocated, it could be redeployed, a small business loan could be made, a mortgage loan could be made. All these various different types of economic activity that are being taken out of the system because so much money is being spent on this needless reconciliation effort. And that's amazingly powerful if over the next several years as you really begin to unleash that.
I just want to tell folks really quickly, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to open it up to questions, so feel free to start brewing those. Could both of you talk about, for both of the examples you gave, I think listening to you, they both just sound like a problem of the world just didn't have a big enough database, So what is it, and we had databases before 2008, we had the internet before 2008, So what is the inside of the blockchain that made both of these solutions more doable?
Well, it's actually, I'm not going to give you a technical answer. It's the trust piece that Michael talked about. If there's one massive database, somebody runs it. Right. Someone is in charge of it. Someone has control over all of your information and what's done with it. And they control whether or not a transaction that you think you did actually went through and whether money you sent to your mother overseas actually arrived there, right? It's a massive trust problem. In a distributed platform, because the platform itself can be trusted and those transactions operate in the way that they do, there is no need for that middleman sitting there that has such control and such a lock-in over what activity you do and the people with whom you do it. So I know that wasn't a technical answer, but actually that's a really, really important answer. That's why this technology in some ways is so mind-blowing. Many different components of blockchain technology have existed for years, but the way in which it's all been put together and the removal of this necessity to trust a centralized counterparty is incredibly powerful, and this is, I think, really something that if you peel back all the layers in the techno-speak, and I'm not a technologist, is the honest answer. Marie should answer this from a technology standpoint, because I can't. But that's the key element, is you're not beholden to any one individual or any one company to make your business run or your individual finances flow.
And I would agree. The fundamental difference is you found a way, yes, there's very nice property that you have this immutability. So you don't just, normally if you have a database that is, replacing your account balance today versus yesterday, you just say, I made a transaction, instead of $100, it's now $90. In blockchain, you keep every one of those trades. And yes, when you get your credit card statement or your, checking account statement, you see that history. But it is not all stored in one place for everyone to see. It is stored by your bank, and you are agreeing to that. Again, they're all linear processes that show, okay, you made a trade. Because you're doing it electronically, we were trying to solve this double spend problem. When you have real currency in the real world, if I buy, a vase from you, and it's at a flea market, you don't need to know who I am, and vice versa. If I think the vase is worth $10 and I give you $10, transaction complete. When you go online, I could give that same $10, quote unquote, to multiple parties, in request for goods, but I still only have one vase. What happened to everybody else? You're now solving that I can clear and settle and see that there's only one asset at one time. So the fact that everybody has a copy and that you can see the history of that, there's only one vase. That there's only one transaction. And instead of having the clearing process and the settlement process, the nostro and verstro account, any of the examples that you would have in a financial model or in a supply chain model now get folded on themselves, and you're fundamentally transforming processes that they don't have to be linear anymore. They are now distributed. And that can suck out just whole chunks of time and cost, and is now changing the model that you don't have a middleman in the middle. That's changing a lot of economics as well, in terms of who and where is there going to be disruption. That is causing a lot of other, questions and comments. But the fact that you could also have the auditor, what takes time when you have an audit? or the reconciliation. It is not the actual process of doing the audit. It is gathering the data. If now the auditor has a node on that network and you can see all the transactions, our first production use case of blockchain, we like to eat our own cooking, and we did it in our global financial accounts. So our global financing business, where we lend money for people to build data centers or what have you, and dispute resolution amongst our own customers, in a complex financial instrument usually isn't about the interest rate. It's some other complicated, did you tax me in the jurisdiction you sent the equipment, or where I signed the contract, or with the supplier that had it, all those kinds of things. We wound up, taking a 44-day reconciliation process that usually involves getting lawyers on phone calls with other lawyers, and cut it down to less than 10, because now it was all implemented as a smart contract directly on the blockchain, and everybody could see. Of course I said that it was going to be taxed at the rate in the UK where we shipped it to. Frees up money, you can reapply it, it disrupts a linear process.
I just want to pick up on one thing that you were talking about a little earlier there, Marie, and that is one thing that Bitcoin first brought into the world, and therefore gave us a concept around which we could build all these other ideas as well, was digital scarcity. Right? So the working assumption for lawyers, so we keep bringing up the lawyers here, for lawyers who had to deal with intellectual property, concepts of value in this what is essentially a service industry. The digital world is full of services. Was that unlike this, it's called the first sale doctrine. So unlike the first sale doctrine that exists in the physical world, whereby my intellectual property, my copyright, for example, in a book, I have universal rights to, and this thing resides in an ethereal sense everywhere. Mm-hmm. We can have a physical thing that captures that concept, and that, as a wrapper, can be a unique digital asset that is scarce and unique, and so therefore I can sell that book. And so you have secondhand bookstores and secondhand record stores, right? All of a sudden the internet came along, and Napster and everyone showed us that we're just like constantly replicating files, and the lawyers were like, there's no way in the world you could actually stand back and say that this piece of digital content is actually scarce. Mm-hmm. I can't say for sure that there's not going to be copied versions of this. So we're going to have to re-engineer how we manage copyright and intellectual property in the digital world. So we'll come up with digital rights management, mm-hmm. which is a litigative. You basically litigate. You just say, so when you had your, back in the days of iTunes, you thought you were actually downloading a song that was yours, that you owned. You didn't. You had a perpetual license with Apple to use this thing, because you really weren't supposed to make a copy of it and give it to somebody else. Right. Now, there's only going to be 21 million Bitcoins ever. That is a unique concept. That's something, and you can't go, by the way, folks, and say, there's a Bitcoin. That's not really the point. Mm-hmm. It's that there is something in the digital realm. There's a record of value that is purely digital and is scarce. And that's a really powerful idea, because now we can map the economy, which thrives on. We need scarcity to put value on things. That's what property is. Now we can take that concept, that offline concept, and apply it into the online world. And we can use smart contracts and interesting things around that value. It's a really, really powerful idea, and it's become all the more powerful with the new concept of non-fungible tokens, NFTs as they're called, which, unlike Bitcoin, which is fungible, you can trade it with anything else, and so one Bitcoin is worth one Bitcoin, and you can trade them back. A non-fungible token is unique. So it's like saying, here is this one-of-a-kind table, here is this one-of-a-kind digital token that is, maybe it represents that table, maybe it's not, maybe it's a song, right? So
it's you and Paul's book.
It's our book. You could have it. The
on
Truth
sale
Machine,
now.
The Truth Machine. Thank you. I had to get around to play. I have a thing to sell as well. Yes. Yeah. The Truth
We're all
Machine.
shilling our wares
You're
up here.
shilling it, yes. I'm looking forward to the day that also I can digitally sign a Kindle book, and so you would actually have a unique
autographed
To
copy.
that point, I mean, a Kindle could be a great wallet. I mean, it would be no problem to make it would be no problem for a Kindle to be a wallet and for you to be able to resell books to other people afterwards. If Amazon's out there and you're working on that, I'd love to do that story. Give me a call. But Yeah, but that was actually one of the first things I ever wrote about in this space. So I have a follow-up question there, but is there a microphone? There's a microphone there
two, I
and a microphone there. Does anyone have questions right now? Oh, we got one right here. Fellow about 5 rows down on this side. If you could, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and saying kind of like, quickly what your interest is here, and obviously we're looking for, succinct questions, but yeah, let us know who you are and what you're interested in.
Hello, this
Yeah.
work? So Morgan Stanley, Xinping Zhu, and I work for legal as well, so I'm very interested in technology. So one thing I think also showed up in the other event at Japan Society, we talk about this massive disintermediation, really kind of worrisome, basically causing a lot of jobs going to be lost, right? So you're talking about billions of dollars in those reconciliation, the banking business, many people working in the mid and back offices. You're talking about those 200 documents need to be produced to send a box of flour from Peru to Rotterdam. There are people working, right? So most of lower wage workers, and what happens to them?
Yeah.
So,
No, I'm happy to take it. Yes. Technological change. Technology changes the way in which businesses functions. Financial services, healthcare, automotive industry, you name it, it absolutely does. And at times, those the changes that it brings in, means that certain people that are doing something can be replaced by technology. That's absolutely true. It also means that a whole set of new business lines that were never conceived of before can now be created. A whole set of new financial products that had never existed before because the technology wasn't there can be created, allowing capital to increase and investment dollars to increase. Now, the reality is, I would say, I'm not in the automotive space, but this is a conversation that the automotive industry had years ago as robots started replacing people on the assembly line. That's a very real problem. The reality is and this is much bigger than blockchain. This is a global issue of what you do when you have a workforce that is trained to do one set of things that at some point becomes obsolete. And that goes well beyond the reconciliation people at banks are doing the rest of it. I think that's a more global problem. I don't claim to have the answer to that. But what I would say is that it isn't all downside. There's a tremendous amount of upside because as these greater efficiencies enter the marketplace, and as this capital is unleashed that allows for student loans and mortgage loans and property investment, a whole host of other things, that also creates jobs on the other end. They're different than the type of jobs that disappeared. They're a whole new set of jobs that require a different set of training and a different part of the populace that's actually performing them. But it's a shifting, and so I don't have a specific answer that that addresses that one reconciliation problem, other than to say technological change doesn't always mean a downside for human involvement in various different business activities. Quite the contrary, it could unleash an capital infusion that would give rise to a whole host of industries that we haven't even thought of yet. And I think it's got to be taken in that context, honestly.
and I'd add, are jobs going to change? Yes. Does that mean jobs are going to go away? I don't think so. I think what people are spending their time on are different. And from a value creation perspective, Gartner estimated there will be $3.1 trillion of new economic value creation by 2030 from blockchain. On the flowers moving cross borders, the study we did of one container shipment of flowers, it spent more time in the ports than on the ocean. And the perishability of flowers is less than 14 days. So by taking, and the estimate is 9 to 14% out, which could go back to GDP, those farmers are going to get more revenue as a result of that because there isn't as much waste. 30% waste in food, 40% in flowers. If you can reduce all that, you're actually providing more economic value back to those original producers, farmers, growers, and that's just one example. The same kind of analogy goes on in the other inefficient spaces where that can be reassigned to do work that is far more value creating than just value moving.
We've got a question here in the middle. so much more I want to say on that topic, but I just want to I could go on a long
That's
time
like a whole
now.
other seminar.
Yeah,
whatever.
right.
My name is Mark Lira, and I work for Sumitomo in agriculture and renewable energy. My question is about some of the fundamentals of blockchain, and we talk about this distributed ledger that basically is able to keep track of transactions on the fly and in parallel. And we see, for example, with Bitcoin, the energy consumption and the computing power required to be able to keep up with all of that seems to be, growing almost exponentially. I mean, people talk about Bitcoin consuming as much energy as Ireland. So is that perhaps a flaw in the design? I mean, how sustainable is it to continue, with this requirement for energy and computing power?
Yeah.
That's why we don't have a mined asset.
Well, I mean, that's a rabbit hole itself. First of all, those numbers are, and this sounds like a cop-out, because I actually do think that proof of work, which is the consensus function within Bitcoin that essentially incentivizes this build-up of computing power that leads to all of that energy function, its one biggest challenge that it faces is precisely what you're talking about, that it uses a lot of energy, and that's not necessarily good for the world. So let me just put that on the table to start with. But I will say, first of all, those measurements are all, it's a wild guess.
It's all just one guy.
It's all one guy who's,
Yeah.
and his
got an
numbers are.
agenda. It really is.
You have to assume the efficiency of a certain machine. You have to assume,
Yeah.
and also like which energy is it taking. The reality is, and this is what's interesting about this, it doesn't mean that those concerns shouldn't be addressed, but just think about this, right? One of the great things about Bitcoin is that it's every player in that network is incentivized to find the cheapest energy it can find, right? So, right now, what is the cheapest energy in the world, anywhere, right? Geothermal in Iceland. It's a wind. It's like
Mongolia.
1.4 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that in certain plains of Mexico because of wind and solar, right? Dubai, this big energy center has been outbidded for its power plants with a fully solar energy system because it was cheaper, not because it's better. It is better, obviously, but it's because it's cheaper. The cheapest energy in the world is renewable. And that cheapness, to some of the stuff Marie's talking about here, by the way, we build supply chains that start to incentivize all the players so that you get paid off when you are using renewable energy, because actually the cost of fossil fuels is hurting all of us. Then that just drives down the cost of renewable even more, and we're all even more incentivized, right? That's a meta conversation around energy. But I'm a Bitcoin player, and that's what's happening to the world, and the right incentives are being built, and the right, governments are starting to do things. I am looking for that stuff, right? What I think is really interesting is that we have to look at this from that holistic perspective. What is happening? And this is not to say that we should sort of hand over the problem to Bitcoin miners, but just remember that if you've got a big industry, if Bitcoin grows to the level where it's important, then you've got an enormous number of miners who are looking for renewable energy. It's a huge incentive for even more investment in the development of renewable energy, right? Now, is there a problem in the sense that miners are actually taking away renewable energy and the rest of us are using fossil fuels? Maybe. But the reality is, what I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to just measure this stuff from an apples to apples perspective, because there's so many things at work in terms of the incentives. It is not an inherent driver of fossil fuel energy. And the other thing to say is that, like, Bitcoin's cost is its security. It is the very fact that it costs you money to build things is its security. So that energy cost is the core component of how this thing works. So the only real way, and I'm not sure how you go about doing the math, but the only real way to assess whether or not it's worth it is to look at all of the costs of all the energy and everything else that goes into this massive legacy system that we've been talking about. Right? So all of that reconciliation, all of the Brinks trucks that have to be used to sort of protect the bank, but all of the banks, all the buildings, all of the stuff that's gone, all of that is costing energy that is essentially, potentially, going to be replaced by a system that is much more fluid in terms of resolving those costs.
Well, and another way of coming at it is, so I'm an environmental whack job, and it's once upon a time how I paid my bills. I was professionally an environmental whack job. And so this is a thing that I worry about a lot. But a separate point to make about distributed technology, and this is a theme of what we've been talking about, is it's good at helping to manage distributed resources. And one of the problems with legacy energy, is, as I'm sure you know, is it's hard to manage lots of energy sources. So here in New York City, when Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012, everybody who had a solar panel, had a solar roof display, had to turn it off, even though there was no electricity on the grid, because they hadn't planned a way to manage that electricity on an individual home, because we weren't good at managing distributed resource sets of energy, right? It's a big regulatory problem. I could go into some weeds about why that is. The point is, whether or not Bitcoin's good or bad, distributed ledgers are good at helping to manage distributed assets. And so I have a lot of optimism that it'll be really helpful for us to have a lot more points of energy creation on the grid, which solves for one of the big problems the grid has, that tons of energy is wasted just through transmission. So anyway, I don't know if either of you had things you want to pop in on that.
We don't have proof of work, so it's not a problem for us.
Yeah. I mean, most non-asset intensive enterprise networks don't have a currency, don't need the mining associated, and there are many other mechanisms beside proof of work for consensus that I think you will see evolving as well. But on the energy point, we're doing work with carbon trading credits on energy consumption grid management. I mean, the use cases that you're talking about how to reduce that energy drain is actually a great use case for blockchain as well.
We have a distributed microgrid in Puerto Rico that I can talk to you a little bit about that we're doing through MIT that's using, basically trying to solve some of these problems about how do you manage energy assets in a distributed way rather than relying on PREPA, which was the very, very badly mismanaged Puerto Rican utility.
Other questions?
Lots of them.
Wow, this is great. You guys are doing awesome. One down here in the front over this way, and I'll do this side definitely next time.
Yes, hi. My name is Guido, and I work in the real property services.
Oh, great.
So I was wondering if it's possible with this technology to transform a fixed asset, let's say like the Chrysler building, into many coins. Thus, you make a typically fixed asset into a liquid. You add liquidity, so you increase the value, and maybe there is room for arbitration.
Kind of answered your own question.
Yeah.
Yes.
I got a bridge to say, by the way. Literally.
It's a great idea. It's a lot of people talking about that.
No, go ahead.
No, that's all I have to say is yes. I think fragmentation of real-world assets is one of the most interesting potential solutions that this technology can bring to add liquidity to those assets. And there are definitely people looking at these sorts of solutions.
Fractional ownership of real estate, of artwork, of tankers, of electric grids, all different from a notion of I've got a stock and a share in equity. I've got an asset, and you're actually measuring the value of the tangible asset with a token life cycle that trades.
Well, even much more, closer to home, just beyond the fractionalization. Here in America, we, unlike most of the rest of the world,
Title.
Yeah, proving that you own a thing is your own responsibility. It's not the state's responsibility. So I can't remember, last time I did the story, we spend like $50 million a year or something, every time something gets sold, proving that the person had the right to sell it and this person can have it. Some countries are working on putting those titles onto blockchain. So even before fractional ownership, there's a ton of money to be saved by the economy by just getting that problem solved.
Correct.
Yeah. Question over on this side, dude in the blue shirt.
Hi, my name's Ben Kreuter, and I'm actually a cryptographer. So I want to challenge you on the response you gave to this guy's question on energy. So everything Bitcoin does could be done without proof of work if you just had an authority giving everyone their identity. So why shouldn't we just have the DMV give everyone a digital identity and save vast amounts of energy?
Yeah, well, that just goes right back to the very beginning question, right?
Yeah.
So because not everybody has a DMV that they can trust, right? So if you're a Syrian refugee your identity has to be asserted by the Assad regime. That's what you're stuck with, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. I mean, it's also just not just about individuals. It's about machines. It's about identifying all of these different entities within that system. So look, it's a debate that we kind of went through basically. And by the way, I'm not as I said right at the beginning, I'm not wedded to the idea that we have to have a fully decentralized system. Nor do I think Bitcoin has to be the only way. I think that we may well create permissioned private systems because our models are going to need them. I just believe that there is real value in permissionlessness as a principle, and therefore that we should be striving for that in some way. The question then is, if Bitcoin is a solution to that, what is the cost of that versus the benefits, right? But yeah, ultimately the problem is there's not a perfect DMV. In fact, DMV is pretty useless, to be honest. It's gotten a lot better, but yes.
So, and this is the point where I think permissioned networks as opposed to anonymous actually make a difference in exactly that regard, because you don't need the mining for the validation against the double spend problem, and why we are doing a lot of work with the DID standards specifically on digital identity. And no, I don't necessarily want to trust the DMV. If they do provide a digital identity for me and something that I can carry in my wallet, great. But for those participants who don't trust or don't have a authority that can grant that, our view is a self-sovereign or peer-to-peer instantiation is necessary. We're doing work with a .org called Mycelia that is focused on digital rights management of music in exactly that regard, that someone can do their own attestation, self-sovereign identity, that I am Marie Wieck. You can have a peer that says, Michael knows me, and provides an additional verification that I am who I said I was. You can have a government or a bank or a charity organization or someone else who knows you, and the more attestation you have, the more verification of your identity, the higher your trust score. Just like a credit score, if that then becomes your digital record, then you can use that for permissioned access in multiple dimensions.
I think the cypherpunk answer there would be, and I think bringing up music is a great example, is, I'm a 40-year-old guy. I want to buy the new Taylor Swift album. That's mildly embarrassing.
Creepy, actually.
Yeah, in the cash world, I could buy the Taylor Swift album, and that wouldn't be a part of the permanent record of my life forever. But in a permissioned blockchain world, now it is always known that at 40 years old, I bought in 1989, And I think that is a part of the answer. Folks are like, why is everything I buy on the internet a part of a permanent record?
But who controls that record? And if you give the rights to it, another
You don't
example.
have a choice, though.
Yeah, we're working with a company called Humanity.co that is trying to create your data is your data. And the 31st human right is that you own your own data, and you can only grant permission of who sees that you bought Taylor Swift to unlock the key cryptographically, to see that transaction.
The challenge, though, is that like we can now, with AI and everything else, reconstruct all of these pieces of fragmented data and suddenly discover that it's actually Marie or Brady.
But if it's
that bought the
digital,
thing.
and that's the intuition, it has nothing to do with blockchain, you're going to discover it anyway.
You can discover
And
it
most
anyway.
people
Exactly.
do
I
today.
do think that one of the things that's going to be interesting around this, and I'm a big believer in self-sovereign identity. I think this is an incredibly empowering concept, and it may indeed reach a point where, because of it, we don't need to have proof of work, and I think that would be potentially really valuable. But it's the fact that currently the route from that to the actual person is still very easy to uncover. I do think that there's some interesting, and I'd like to hear the cryptographer's take on this, although we probably should go to another question. Homomorphic encryption, which is still really difficult to do and expensive, at least holds out this potential that we might be able to, use zero-knowledge proofs and all sorts of other things to essentially hide a lot of that information and still know that the transaction was valid.
Quantum.
So this is like quantum, maybe, yep, IBM's got some value there. So potentially we have ways to have our cake and eat it too.
Yep.
But basically what we're getting at here is that identity is a thorny problem
Yeah.
that raises all sorts of, challenging questions.
Well, we should wrap up. So let me see if we can do a lightning answer from you guys to end, and then we'll all talk. So you guys got to go. We have a reception afterwards. We can all ask questions of each other then. But let's do quick lightning response. Try to be like super fast. I know what mine will be. But if each of you could just give the example of, I'm going to make you start, Michael. Give an example of the first time something in blockchain or crypto kind of blew your mind.
Kind of blew my mind, I think, was when I thought about property records, actually, and it just occurred to me that what Hernando de Soto, who I got to know for some time, the Peruvian economist, had been working on all these years to try to prove that property title was something that the poor needed to be able to break the cycle of poverty, that we might be able to challenge the sort of fate that they had in their connection to a registry that was controlled by a crook, that they now could prove their assets. That, to me, was mind-blowing, because I could then think of everything else that he was talking about.
Cool.
I mean, I would say just the traceability in a global supply chain, that you can actually get back to a source, whether it's for food, whether it's for, mining, whether it's for gems, luxury goods. The fact that you actually can prove back to origin for things like sustainability and for, fair trade was pretty mind-blowing.
It was honestly, this is going to sound super basic. It was the entire idea of a distributed system that worked together to function as one. I thought that was so at odds. My father was a computer programmer, and when he was first looking, he's like, this is nuts. I don't understand how this works. That to me was absolutely amazing, that there's a system that is controlled by no one, that doesn't just sit one place, all works together in this incredibly powerful way. That, frankly, I'm still a little confused by it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was when there's this investor here in New York, Fred Wilson of Union Square Ventures, who's made just unbelievable piles of money going long on the internet. And one day I heard him say, I learned about Bitcoin, and it was the first time I was able to say, wow, money can be native to the internet. And that made it click for me. So thanks on everybody. See you all at the reception. I'm sure there's lots more questions. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Mary, Charlie, and Michael.
Thanks, man.